Against our studios at Florida Atlantic University, I'm Dr. Kevin Wagner, co-director of the Political Communication Laboratory.
And I'm Antonio Fins, politics editor at the Palm Beach Post.
Today, Antonio and I are going to talk a little bit about our new poll of the state of Florida, taking a look at the presidential race and some other important issues inside of Florida. So come along with us.
All right, as the slide says, the race is on. The vice president and the former president, a lot tighter than maybe a lot of people would have expected in your poll.
Yeah, I think you can see the trend line has certainly gone towards Vice President Harris, and you can see the race is considerably tighter than it was when we first started measuring this. I think it's a reflection of a more national trend that we're seeing in other states where the race has become much, much closer since Vice President Harris became the top of the ticket. I think increasingly, even in a place like Florida, which has a Republican lean, you're seeing a much more competitive race as she is able to consolidate a lot of those Democratic supporting groups that were sort of drifting a little bit when Joe Biden was at the top of the ticket, but have come home since, and that has made this a much, much closer race.
Any indication on how she's doing with, for example, those independent voters, which is a huge part of the electorate in Florida?
Yeah, at this point, I think the numbers seem to tell us that the strength of her movement is really in the consolidation phase, where you're seeing many of the groups that traditionally would support Democrats but weren't very enthusiastic about Joe Biden. I think one of the things that we can see now is that they've really come home to Harris, and so that has really pushed this into a tight race. Ultimately, it looks like what this will be is a turnout race. Whoever is able to generate more enthusiasm among their base and get those voters out is likely to have the advantage here. But I think we've reached the equilibrium state where the Democrats have come home, Republicans have come home, and we have a tight race.
All right. What about the X factor, or the, should we say, the RFK Jr. factor, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his impact on the race? How do you see that shaking out?
Yeah, you know, the interesting irony is that in the very beginning of this sort of conversation about RFK Jr., the thought was that he would hurt the Democrat. But I think as is in our poll and in other polls, you're seeing increasingly that when you add him to the race tightens, and actually Donald Trump actually loses a little bit. In this particular case, again, this race is tighter with RFK Jr. in it. Harris is closer to Trump with RFK Jr. in it. So at least for now, he appears to be hurting Trump just a little bit.
All right. Action. Well, as the slide says, Walz is okay. So tell us about the vice president's choice of a running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz.
Yeah, you know, the number one thing that a presidential candidate does when selecting a vice president is to make sure they don't pick somebody that hurts the ticket. And in this particular case, I think the clearest sign that Walz was at least a safe choice is that there's no real evidence that he's pulled the Harris support down. And in fact, there is some suggestion here in Florida that he's been a net positive. And at least for now, and it's relatively early, right? So people are still learning about Tim Walz. At least for now, Tim Walz seems to be a net positive to the ticket.
Any demographic groups, anything in the numbers that jumps out at you that maybe he either energized, you know, the Democrats, or he can pull in some independents? Anything you've seen along those lines?
Yeah, hard to tell in our numbers in Florida. Right now, it just looks like, and particularly if you look at the breakdown of the people supporting Walz, that it's a highly partisan breakdown. So Democrats are very enthusiastic about Walz, Democrats like Walz, and of course, Republicans are, you know, not as positive about Tim Walz. And that, you know, that's to be expected to some degree because of the way that we see things with our partisan lenses. But there isn't anything so far about Walz that has really changed the dynamic other than to give some more support for Harris.
I got to ask, because of the previous polling, it showed that J.D. Vance as the choice on the part of the Republicans was a bit controversial, perhaps even in Florida. How's this going to shake out, or is it really going to be a Harris versus Trump race?
It's almost always the top of the ticket that drives how people vote. So I think we probably spend a little bit too much time, even right here, talking about the VP selections. But the one thing that the VP selection does do reflect on the top of the ticket is it's really the only major decision that a candidate makes while they're running, or at least the major substantive decision that they make. And because of that, it reflects on their decision making. And if Walz is seen as a positive selection, it reflects well on Harris. And if Vance is not seen as that positive a selection, it would reflect less well on Trump. But I think it's worth pointing out that it's still relatively early in the VP selection digestion situation where people are still trying to figure out what they think of these candidates to reach too many conclusions. But I think it is safe to say that Walz has had at least a bit better of an introduction than Vance has over the course of their the last month.
Right. Well, this one, Rick Scott's small lead in the race for the U.S. Senate for his reelection. This one's kind of an interesting one. You know, it looks to be a lot more competitive. When you first started polling, he had almost like a double-digit lead, if I recall, and now it's really shrunk quite a bit. Tell us about it.
Yeah, when we first took a look at this race, we had Senator Scott well out ahead. When we polled it a second time, it was much closer, and again, it's pretty close here as well. This one's not quite as close as the presidential race, though. In this particular case, we have a 4-point gap, and that's actually outside the margin of error. So this actually is a Scott lead in this particular case, which shows he's actually running a little bit better than President Trump right now. But it is close enough that I think it bodes for a more competitive race, and this is our second poll in a row where we had a competitive race in the Senate race. So this is one to watch.
Are you able at this point to see how much more of a higher ceiling Debbie Merkersel-Powell, assuming that she is the nominee of the party, still has here? Because I'm assuming that a lot of the gain that she has made has been among name recognition among Democrats. So is there more of a ceiling here, or what's your sense?
Yeah, I think that's fair, and certainly some of the support that she's shown is a consolidation of the Democratic Party in Florida as Democrats come to know her a little bit better and they line up behind her. But you know, the difficult thing about ceilings here is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of movement outside of partisan identification, which is to say that Democrats are backing the Democrat and Republicans are backing the Republican. And it's probably worth pointing out, if we're trying to be as fair as we can here, that because the state has a Republican lean, the likelihood is that if both parties motivate their voters to come out, if both parties get strong turnout, you're going to have a slight Republican lean here, and it's going to lead to a bit of an advantage for Senator Rick Scott. And I think that's actually what you're seeing here, which is Republicans and Democrats, you know, when they're behind their candidate, it's still a slightly favorable environment for Republicans.
So it does suggest, though, then, that Rick Scott has consolidated the Republican vote, that he, you know, there's a lot of questions about how popular he is and so forth, but it does strike you that perhaps he has, at the very least, consolidated the Republican vote.
Yeah, it certainly looks so. Right, it looks like that right now, and there's no reason to believe that he won't continue to do that. That makes the challenge for the Democrats to motivate their voters to come out in slightly higher numbers to try and narrow that gap a bit. But you know, this is the second time in a row we've seen that gap, and that's the challenge for Democrats in a state that's increasingly trending a little bit more red to try and overcome those kinds of numbers and supports the Republicans have, and that's going to be a challenge. So right now, you know, even though it's a narrow gap, it has been a consistent gap.
All right. All right, two high-profile constitutional amendments. One of them, the amendment number 3, that deals with legalizing recreational marijuana. You got it in the lead, but really important, not 60%, which is what you need, the threshold, the minimum number of percent to be approved and to be added to the state constitution. Tell us what you're finding.
Yeah, I think that's really the key finding here, which is that if you look across, even when you look inside the numbers at the various groups, there's pretty widespread support for the passage of this amendment, even across demographic groups. The difficulty for supporters of the amendment is that even though there's a majority support, majority doesn't get you an amendment passed in Florida. You have to get to the 60%, and our numbers, they're not quite there. They could be there, because you can see the undecided are enough if they can persuade enough of them to get to 60%, and the support certainly is there, but not quite enough yet to get to that 60% threshold.
Any particular demographic group that it seems to be polling either really strongly with or soft?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to surprise anyone that this is a little more popular among young voters, and probably doesn't surprise anyone that it's definitely much more popular among Democrats than it is among Republicans. And I think that's where the drag is for people supporting the amendment, especially Republicans are a little more wary of this amendment. They're a little less likely to be supportive of it. In fact, a lot less likely than Democrats in this particular case. So if you're supporting this amendment, you have some persuasion to do on the Republican side.
Well, it's kind of interesting because one of the axioms about politics is that older people vote, younger people speak up, but don't necessarily cast their vote. So perhaps this is one word, the younger electorate, if they show up, could have a meaningful role in the outcome.
Yeah, maybe even a more meaningful outcome than just this amendment, which obviously is very meaningful to many people on both sides. But if this amendment drives young people to turn out in higher percentages than they typically vote in elections, and remember, younger people often do vote in smaller numbers than older voters do. But if this generates bigger turnout among younger voters, it could affect some of the races we've already talked about, including the presidential race and the Senate races. Those young people are here to vote for this amendment, but while they're there, they're going to also take a chance to vote on some of the other races as well. And that could, you know, if they're close enough, that could affect the outcome.
All right. Well, among the high-profile constitutional amendments, Amendment 4, dealing with abortion and reproductive rights, may actually be the highest profile one. And you got it again, clear majority, but as we said before, it takes 60% to pass. What have you found?
Yeah, it's striking how similar the results here are to the Amendment 3. In this case, the demographics are a little more interesting. Republicans are kind of split on this amendment, where Democrats are overwhelmingly in favor of it. And again, you're seeing young people a bit more enthusiastic about this amendment. It should be very, very interesting to see whether or not they can get the push to get to 60%. I think if I were it's pretty clear that they're going to get a majority, but again, the majority is not enough in Florida. They got to get to 60% to get this passed. And it's not necessarily clear that they can get there, but it should be close.
Are you surprised, given that you've got Democrats really behind it, Republicans seem to be more supportive of it than some of the other amendments, and yet, young people as well, and yet it's not at 60%? What are we missing here?
Yeah, this is one of those in political science we would call a cross-cutting issue, which is it doesn't split exactly along partisan lines. While Democrats clearly are in support of it, Republicans are very mixed on it. And so to the degree, you're going to need a little more support among Republicans and some people that are a little bit wary of this amendment to get to that 60%. Remember, 60% is a very big number. 60% is a supermajority, right? And so it's very difficult to get there. It's clear that if the threshold were 50%, they would be there. But 60%, that's a tough number to reach. And right now, at least in our numbers, they're not quite there yet, but they are within striking distance. So it's going to be a competitive a battle between the people that support and oppose this amendment all the way to November, I would think.
As we said before, also the independent voters, where do they land? Have you seen any discernible patterns?
Yeah, it's hard to say because remember, at the end of the day, independent voters are lots of different categories of voters. Right. And many people in Florida that are highly partisan often identify as independent because they don't like to join one party or the other. So that can be a little bit misleading here. Of course, we have not a huge discernible pattern on that. But those are, look, at the end of the day, two things are going to matter. Do the voters that are most passionate about this, do they turn out and do they vote, whether they're for it or against it? And are they able to persuade some of those voters that are not quite sure which way to go? Those are the two factors that are going to make the difference here. But it's going to, 60% again is a big number.
All right. Well, it looks like the high cost of living and inflation is an issue that we've been talking about for a number of years. You've polled it. What have you learned?
Yeah, people don't like it, which I suppose you didn't really need a poll for. Shocking. Well, the more interesting part about this particular question is who they blame for the high cost of living, because of course in Florida we're dealing with everything from insurance costs to housing costs, to even car insurance costs. And so the cost of living here is certainly on the mind of many Floridians. But it probably won't surprise you, Antonio, to learn that the blame seems to be very different depending on which political party somebody identifies with. For Democrats, the blame goes to the state government, and for Republicans, increasingly the blame goes to the national government. So not a huge surprise here, but both of them are unhappy.
Well, as a longtime business writer, I'm a little bit surprised that even inflation becomes a partisan issue, but it looks like it has become that way.
Yeah, that's one of the truths about modern America today, is that much of what we see and deal with is seen through partisan lenses. And
it's back to school time here in Palm Beach County and Broward County and most of South Florida. You polled about starting school in August. What'd you find?
Well, we kind of figured when we looked at this one that this would be one of those where parents are saying, why do they keep going back to school so early? And of course, many parents remember the traditional start of date, which is after Labor Day. So we asked Floridians, do we go back to school too early? My expectation was they would say yes, but that's not what our polling looks like. In fact, the plurality generally think that it's okay to come back in early August. So not a big response in the way that I thought.
Well, for me, when I was a kid, it was either September, August, didn't matter. I didn't want to go back to school. I liked summer and going on vacation and partying, but it looks like August start date is not an issue because it has been controversial in the past.
Yeah, there was a lot of concern because they pushed back the start date to make sure they had enough days ahead of testing, right. And there was concern that students were losing part of their summer. But it doesn't appear, at least at this, in these numbers, that parents are that bothered by the early start. Maybe they're ready for their kids to go back to school. If you found this video helpful, we invite you to hit the like and subscribe buttons, to visit our website and see some of our other